The Where To UI is a pretty big piece of the puzzle, and it also includes the navigation UI, which is the bottom portion. Up until now we focused on this part of the toolbar area. Now we need to do this portion. The destination UI toggle is a huge part of the navigation UI. It's the bottom section of the form that contains the list of destinations. We can build it on top of the code we wrote for the navigation UI and place it in the center of the layer, so it will play nicely with the rest of the UI. For now, I'll ignore this portion, as it's mostly a specialization of other things and can be done relatively easily if you understand the rest of the things I did. Let's jump right into the show navigation bar method. The top elements are relatively simple multi-buttons. We use container as their UI ID, so they will be transparent with zero padding and margin. The separator is just a label with a specific style. Notice that blank label buttons, etc. are hidden by default in codename 1, and you should invoke setShow even if blank if you want such a label to still render. We can reuse the form UI ID here, because that's effectively what we want. We want this UI to appear as if it's a form. We need this to be scrollable, but we don't want the scroll bar on the side as it might cause aesthetic issues. The showing of this element is animated from the bottom of the form. While this UI is very simple, it did define a few UI IDs. Let's start with Where To button line 1, which represents the entries in the list of elements and also adds the underline. The color is just black over transparent, which in this case leads to white. The padding on the left side is relatively low, since the icon will take the extra padding. On the other sides, we have typical 4mm padding. Margin is 0 as usual. We put the underline here because the design placed the underline only under the text and didn't place it under the icon, which has a different UI ID. The underline is a gray 2-pixel high line. The font is the standard 3mm light font. The Where To button icon style applies to the icon, which has less horizontal padding, so it won't drift too far from the text, but identical vertical padding, so it will align properly with the text. It derives from Where To button line 1, so they will fit together well. We need the no border version of the style, so it will remove the underline border on the last entry. Otherwise, we can see an out of place underline in that one last entry in the list. We derive from the same style, so everything else is identical. The WhereSeparator is just a gray padded line, so it has the right gray color and is completely opaque, so with no background transparency. It's exactly 2mm tall, so it will stand out but won't take out an entire line. Margin is 0, so it can reach the edge of the parent container. Now that we added this, we need to show this UI and hide it when the user toggles the focus in the text fields. We can do this by binding focus listeners to the to and from text fields. When focus is lost or gained, we toggle between the square and circle modes by setting the icon to the appropriate labels. We always have one container in the layer, except for the case where the second component is the where-to container. It's always the second component because it's always added last. We set the position of this container below the forms. Animate Unlayout moves the component outside of the screen to the position we asked for using a smooth animation. This callback is invoked when the unlayout completes. At this point, we have an invalid UI that needs a layout. But before we do that, we remove the component that we animated out of the form. Now that the UI appears, we also need to remove it when going back. So I'll update the back action listener from above to handle the where-to UI as well. This is the exact same unlayout operation we did before. And finally, we need to make a subtle but important change to the background painter code from before. Because of the drop shadow, a gap is formed between the top and bottom pieces. So a special case here paints a white rectangle under the shadow to hide the gap. Without that, the shadow would appear on top of the map and not on top of the white background. Once this is done, opening the where-to UI and toggling the fields should work as expected.